Hi, my name's Sylvia Lighthart, and I'm 37 years old. And I just say that because it's taken me this long to really figure out who I am, and that's because of figuring out who I am in God and who He created me to be. So to share my testimony, I kind of go back to when I was little because my mom just didn't know how to love. Growing up, I only lived with my real father for a couple of years, and that was 4 to 6, and he was really a pretty mean guy and abusive. Lived with my mother for a long time, but it was always off and on with her. And so you kind of just grow up feeling kind of abandoned and fatherless and motherless. And so we end up with our grandparents from 12 on. And from there, it's a repeat kind of what was as a young kid. They talk about generational curses, and unfortunately in my family there is a lot of sexual abuse, and that touched us even as young children. I remember the first time was an uncle tried to touch me inappropriately, and I told my DHS worker actually, and she'd asked the adults and they all denied everything. And I remember that being the first time I was in 2nd grade, and that I felt like nobody really cares about me, that my voice isn't going to be heard and nobody cares. And so by the time we got to 12, with our grandparents, that was kind of an instilled thought within me. And then with our grandparents, my grandfather was a very angry man and very controlling. And so for him specifically, he instilled a lot of fear. It was his way or no way, and if you disagreed, sometimes there were consequences, sometimes it was just a scare tactic. But I do remember one time disagreeing with something with him and arguing with him about it, and out of reaction, he choked me almost till I passed out. And that was just one of the little scary things that happened. And my grandmother was an alcoholic, and so when she would get drunk, sometimes if you didn't stay out of the way, then you'd be called names. I specifically would be called names and just told how awful I was. And that was because my grandfather was sexually abusing me, and I was treated like the other woman in both people's views. And my grandfather was very possessive of me and controlling, so I wasn't allowed to do anything but come home. When I got old enough to work, he would come to my work and watch me for hours. So my grandmother was very jealous in a sense, instead of protecting me. At 15, I tried to end my life by just overdosing on pills and alcohol because I just didn't want to be in that environment anymore. That didn't happen, thankfully, but even in that spot, like the night that happened, I told my grandfather what I'd done, and of course his reaction was one of anger. And we kept driving to my sister's work and sat in the parking lot whenever I was feeling like I was probably going to die, and it happened to be across the road from the emergency room. And I remember sitting in the truck looking at the big lights that said emergency room, thinking he was going to let me die sitting there. And thankfully God had a different plan, but that's just kind of what I knew, like I just wasn't worth anything to anyone. Thankfully, the one thing that I was allowed to do growing up was go to church with one of my friends. So I remember at 17, I was baptized and began my relationship with God. Where the first verse I ever memorized was Romans 8:15. You were not born again to fear, but by adoption, whereby we cry out, Abba, Father. But when I read that verse, it was just like a love I'd never known just leapt off the page and right into my heart, to think that there was a Father who loved me and cared about me and didn't want me to be afraid. So for me, that was the start of a relationship with God. And it was amazing to me that there was somebody that loved me and cared about me. From there, I luckily, thankfully had teachers at school that took an investment within me and saw something worthwhile and got scholarships for me and things like that, and I got to go to college. And I remember the first person I ever told about sexual abuse was my roommate, who had known me since I was 13. And so I'd lived around her and in her life for that many years, and she never knew. It was very kind of surreal, to tell somebody, because you're just so ashamed and you carry the burden, the guilt of yourself, although it makes no sense, but you do. You think it's your fault and there's something wrong within you. And I never really asked God why, but I remember one time asking why me, like why he chose me. Because I always thought there was some dysfunction within myself that caused him to do those things to me. And God's answer was not what I expected, but it was never about you, and that sounds really weird, but it was about him and his evil heart. So I sought counseling there at the college, and which is a big deal to tell somebody, you know. And I remember the time that she was like, this is above and beyond me, and asked me to make a phone call to a real counselor. And that was super duper duper scary for some reason. And I made that phone call, but I didn't keep that appointment. So I never went on to tell anybody else or to seek anything for that until I was 25. And by that time, I had already graduated like nursing school. I had a 4-year-old daughter. But all of a sudden, I started having flashbacks and panic attacks, and it affected my relationship with my husband at the time and just people, because I wanted to be so wanted and accepted that I would become in a social situation and try to become whatever I thought somebody wanted me to become, because I wanted to be loved and wanted so much. I went to counseling for about a year, and that was amazing. People talk about generational curses. Something happens from generation to generation to generation. And unfortunately in my family, this sexual sin and abuse is all over the place. I mean, I have people in my family that probably still experience it, honestly. But God's so good that my children are going to be the first generation that it's not going to touch, and that's going to not be bound by those things. And that's because of the goodness of God. I've allowed God to come into my life and my heart and show them there's a hope for a future and a different way of life. And he protects them, and that's pretty amazing. I still deal with a lot of anxiety sometimes, and I just remember like the verse, and I probably don't have it memorized, but it's Jeremiah 29:11. But you know, it's pretty much that he has a hope for the thoughts that he thinks toward us, and that's for a hope and a future and good things, and not to be afraid. And fear has just gripped my life for so long, and that's the chain, one of the chains that God's breaking in my life, because I still deal with that at times, but he always has a verse, his word tells me different. That's so comforting, because like I said, I grew up without a lot of comforting things and people that would even comfort me. I'm very romantic at times in my ideas, and I just think about like laying my head in God's lap and crying as if he was my father, and that's super comforting to me. Back to my real father, I didn't know him, and I went through something called Making Peace with Your Past, and the very last chapter is about forgiveness. And I'd already forgiven my grandfather and my mother and my grandmother and all those people. And God, when I was writing it down, God like put down his name. And I was like, God, that's crazy, because as far as I'm concerned, he just doesn't, in my world, he just doesn't exist really. I don't know him. And God's like, nope, you need to reach out to him. And I was like, okay, maybe tomorrow. And a couple weeks went by and I still hadn't done it. And lo and behold, about 3 weeks went by and he messaged me in Messenger. And I was like, okay, God. And so then I was able to write him a whole thing about what I'd been through, how I felt, what he had done when I was young affected me, his not being there affected me, and all those things. And thankfully, in this story, he came back with an I'm sorry. And we kind of kept in contact for a few months. And probably about 6 months later, he got really sick. And so I made the decision, I thought I needed to go see him, and I hadn't seen him in about 24 years. So I drove and saw him in the hospital room. You know, at one point everybody kind of left, and I tried to lean over to give him a hug, but I'm kind of short. And so therefore it's almost like my head was laying on his chest. And at that moment our eyes connected, and he just looked at me and said the things that a little girl had always dreamed of hearing. And that's, I love you and you're beautiful and I'm so proud of you. And that was a chapter I didn't even know needed to be closed, but God knew. And to have that validation from my physical father was super important. And I didn't know that was important, but it was. You know, and he passed away 6 weeks later. My purpose out of all that is not to say poor me, but to say how great God is, and that he can take a little girl that was in that state and bring her up here to be someone to rise to the occasion, I guess. Like God, like I know who I am in Christ. I felt His calling for years, and I was always that spunky girl that was really vivacious and bold. And through the years, I became not that person. I became very scared and very frightened of people and very just want to be alone and really just scared. And God now is bringing me back around to be like, nope, this is who I created you to be, Sylvia. And so therefore stand up in the boldness of who I created you to be. So no matter what you're going through, where you've been, it doesn't matter to God because He created you. And so I just want to say, like, there is hope. God loves you. You're not alone. I promise you're not alone.